What could make a little girl who hadn't smiled in nearly 2 years suddenly break her silence at a cowboy's supper table? Daniel's fork froze halfway to his mouth. Beside him, Sophie stared at Rachel's lopsided apple pie, and a tiny laugh slipped through her lips. Chairs creaked. Coffee cups stopped midair. Rachel looked from the silent cowboys to Daniel's stunned face, wondering what she had just awakened. "Stay with us and tell us what you think." Snow had begun falling over Red Mesa before the supper bell rang. Not much at first, just thin white flakes drifting past the kitchen windows, catching against the dark rails of the corral and melting on the backs of horses waiting near the barn. By 6 o'clock, the road toward Pine Hollow had disappeared beneath a pale covering, and the mountains west of the ranch were nothing more than charcoal shapes against the evening sky. Inside the main dining room, 20 men were eating. Boots scraped against the plank floor. Tin forks clicked against heavy white plates. Wet coats hung from pegs near the door, giving off the smell of snow, leather, and horse. At the head of the long table sat Daniel Mercer. He ate slowly, as he always did. Across from him, his 7-year-old daughter Sophie had not touched much of her supper. A piece of roast beef had been cut into careful squares on her plate. Mashed potatoes sat untouched beside it. Her milk had gone nearly warm. Daniel noticed all of this without seeming to look. He had gotten good at that. Nearly 2 years had passed since Sophie's mother died, and in that time Daniel had learned the 1,000 small ways a father could watch a child without making her feel watched. Sophie hated questions. She hated people crouching in front of her and speaking too softly. "Are you feeling all right? Do you remember what happened? Can you say something for me, sweetheart?" Daniel had watched doctors ask, churchwomen ask, his sister ask. He had watched Sophie disappear a little farther behind those dark eyes each time. So he no longer asked. He simply made certain her room stayed warm, that her boots fit, that a lamp burned in the upstairs hall after dark, and that nobody at Red Mesa treated her silence as entertainment. Tonight, she sat beside him in a blue wool dress, with one sleeve slightly twisted at the wrist. Her brown hair had come loose from its braid near one ear. Daniel wanted to straighten it. He didn't. At the opposite end of the room, the kitchen door swung open. Rachel Turner came through carrying a pie. Several men turned. Rachel had been at Red Mesa less than a month, but the ranch hands had already developed a habit of watching whenever she carried something out of that kitchen. That had not been true the first week. Daniel remembered that clearly. Rachel set the pie in the middle of the table and stepped back. It was supposed to be apple. It smelled like apple, cinnamon, browned sugar, butter, and the sharp sweetness of fruit spread through the room almost immediately. Its appearance was another matter. The crust had collapsed badly on one side. A strip of pastry had folded inward during baking, leaving the whole thing leaning slightly, as though it had survived an argument. Rachel stared at it with both hands on her hips. She wore a plain brown dress beneath a flour-dusted apron. Her sleeves were rolled to her elbows, revealing strong forearms reddened from the heat of the kitchen. A loose strand of chestnut hair clung to her temple. She did not look pleased. Ben Carter, the youngest cowhand at the table, leaned sideways for a better look. Ben had the unfortunate combination of being 21 and believing nearly every thought deserved to be spoken. He scratched his chin. "Miss Turner," he said, "I believe my saddle horse stepped on something looked about like that this afternoon." Wade Thompson lowered his coffee mug. 1 or 2 men stopped chewing. Daniel looked toward Rachel. 3 weeks earlier, that kind of remark might have tightened the whole room. Now Rachel merely examined the pie again. Then she looked at Ben. "If your horse did it," she said, "he probably made a cleaner edge." A few men laughed. Ben grinned. "Well, ma'am, he's had more practice with his feet than I have with pastry. Then I'll hire him Sunday." That drew a louder laugh. Daniel felt the corner of his mouth move before he stopped it. Rachel reached for the pie knife. Then a sound came from beside him. Small. So small Daniel thought at first that one of the chairs had creaked. His hand froze around his fork. Nobody else seemed certain either. Rachel glanced toward Sophie. The child was staring at Ben. Her lips had moved. Not much. Just the faintest bend at one corner. Ben, still enjoying his own joke, pointed toward the pie. "I'd still eat it." Rachel narrowed her eyes. That wasn't the question. And then Sophie smiled. It wasn't large. There was no laughter filling the room, no sudden miracle that could be held up and named. Just a smile. A real one. Her cheeks lifted. Her eyes changed. A breath slipped through her nose with the beginning of a sound behind it. Daniel's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Across the table, Wade went completely still. Ben's grin disappeared. Nobody spoke. Sophie seemed to realize suddenly that everyone was looking at her. The smile began to vanish. Rachel saw it. She turned immediately toward the pie. "Well," she said, as though nothing unusual had happened, "if nobody wants the ugly piece, that's the piece I'm taking." The room released its breath. Ben raised a hand. "I'll take ugly." "You already have," Wade muttered. The men laughed again. This time nobody looked toward Sophie. Daniel did. Only for a second. The little smile was gone, but something remained around her eyes. A looseness. A warmth he had almost forgotten belonged there. Rachel cut the pie. She served Wade first, then Ben, then worked her way down the table. When she reached Sophie, she did not ask whether the girl wanted any. She simply placed a narrow slice beside her plate. Sophie looked down at it, then toward Rachel. Rachel had already moved on. Daniel watched her. 3 weeks. That was how long Rachel Turner had been living at Red Mesa. 3 weeks of flour on the counters and coffee before daylight. 3 weeks of his men suddenly finding excuses to pass through the kitchen. 3 weeks of strange little shapes made from bread dough appearing on a windowsill. 3 weeks since Daniel had stood at the Pine Hollow stage stop and looked at the woman who stepped down carrying one trunk and realized, with some embarrassment now, that she was not remotely the person he had expected. Rachel finished serving the pie and returned to the kitchen. Daniel waited 10 seconds, then he followed. The kitchen was hot enough to fog the lower corners of the windows. 2 lamps burned above the work table. Copper pans hung from hooks near the stove. A flour sack leaned against the pantry wall beside the latch Daniel had repaired himself during Rachel's first week. Rachel stood at the wash basin with her back to him. She knew he was there. He could tell because her shoulders changed slightly. "You need something?" she asked. Daniel looked through the open doorway toward the dining room. Sophie was visible between 2 ranch hands. She had taken 1 bite of pie. "No." Rachel turned. Daniel removed his hat, though he wasn't sure why. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he said. She smiled. Rachel's expression softened only slightly. "I saw. She hasn't—" The rest caught somewhere behind his ribs. He had stopped sentences like that so many times over the last 2 years that it had become habit. Rachel waited. She did not finish it for him. Daniel looked down at his hat. She hasn't done that in a long time. Rachel wiped flour from her fingers with the corner of her apron. "Ben is pretty funny when he isn't trying." Daniel almost laughed. He looked at her again. She was not pretending she had performed some miracle. That mattered. Most people who had gotten any reaction from Sophie immediately wanted more. Another smile. A word. Proof. Rachel seemed satisfied to leave the moment exactly where it was. "You didn't look at her," Daniel said. "When?" After she smiled, Rachel understood. She noticed everyone else. Daniel nodded. I figured she didn't need one more pair of eyes. For some reason, that answer landed harder than he expected. He stood there with his hat between his hands while the stove popped softly behind her. Rachel glanced toward the dining room. You should go back before Ben eats your pie. Daniel put on his hat. He wouldn't. He absolutely would. This time the smile escaped him. Small, unplanned. Rachel saw it. Neither of them mentioned that either. Daniel returned to the dining room. Sophie had eaten half her slice. Outside, the snowfall had thickened. White gathered along the porch rails and swallowed the wagon tracks leading toward Pine Hollow. Daniel sat beside his daughter and picked up his fork. He did not ask her about the smile. He did not ask if she liked the pie. He merely moved the little dish of sugar closer to her because she had always liked a pinch over baked apples. Sophie glanced at him, then back toward the kitchen door. Daniel followed her gaze. Rachel's shadow moved behind the frosted glass. He had hired a baker. That was all. A woman from Kansas City answering an advertisement because Red Mesa needed somebody who could feed 20 men through a Colorado winter. He had not invited change into his house. He had certainly not gone looking for it. Yet sitting beside a daughter whose face had been still for almost 2 years, Daniel could not ignore what he had just seen. Something had shifted, and to understand why, he would have to go back 3 weeks. Back to a cold afternoon at the Pine Hollow stage stop. Back to the woman standing beside one battered trunk while strangers looked her up and down. Back to the first moment Daniel Mercer saw Rachel Turner and made the mistake nearly everyone else had made before him. He underestimated her. The stage from Denver rolled into Pine Hollow a little after 3 in the afternoon, its wheels grinding through a crust of frozen mud along Main Street. A cold November wind pushed grit against the boardwalks and made the sign above Cooper's General Store creak on its hooks. Daniel stood beside the hitching rail with one gloved hand resting on the horn of his saddle. He had been waiting 20 minutes. That already had him in a poor mood. The advertisement he had placed 3 weeks earlier had been plain enough. Red Mesa Ranch needed a baker who could feed 20 men through winter, manage provisions, rise before daylight, and work without much supervision. The reply had come from Kansas City in neat handwriting, signed Rachel Turner. Nothing in the letter had suggested what she looked like. Daniel had formed a picture anyway. Someone narrow and hard from years beside a hot oven. A widow, maybe. Older. The kind of woman who could carry a sack of flour under one arm and threaten a lazy ranch hand with a wooden spoon under the other. The stage door opened. 2 men climbed down first, then an older woman with a hatbox, then Rachel Turner. She stepped carefully onto the iron step and lowered one boot to the frozen street. Daniel looked once, then again. She was taller than he expected, with a full figure beneath a dark green traveling coat and broad shoulders that made the coat pull slightly across the back. Her cheeks were pink from the cold. Brown hair had been pinned beneath a plain felt hat, though the wind had already loosened several strands around her face. She carried herself upright. Not proudly exactly. More like somebody who had learned not to give strangers an excuse to think she needed help. The driver lowered a single trunk from the roof. Rachel looked around. Daniel knew the moment she found him. Her eyes paused on the ranch coat, the dusty boots, the Mercer brand burned into the saddle blanket behind him. She came toward him. Mr. Mercer? Yes. Rachel Turner. Daniel tipped his hat. There was a pause. He hated himself for it almost immediately. But she saw it. Of course she saw it. Rachel glanced down at herself and then back at him. If you're wondering whether the letter was mine, she said, it was. Daniel cleared his throat. I wasn't wondering that. No? No. She waited. The wind moved between them. Daniel looked toward the trunk. You traveled alone? Yes. From Kansas City? Yes. Another pause. Rachel's mouth tightened slightly. You ask every baker this many questions before supper? That caught him off guard. No. Good. I was starting to think I'd answered the wrong advertisement. Daniel looked at her more carefully then. Not at her body, at her face, too. There was tiredness there. Not the kind one night of bad sleep caused. Something older. He nodded toward the trunk. Red Mesa is about 40 minutes from here if the North Road isn't frozen solid. I can manage 40 minutes. I didn't say you couldn't. You looked like you were deciding. Daniel almost denied it. Instead, he took the trunk by one handle. Rachel caught the other. I have it, he said. So do I. For 1 second, neither let go. Then Daniel released his side. Rachel lifted the trunk herself and carried it the short distance to the wagon. It was not light. He could tell from the way the leather straps strained. She put it down without comment. Daniel said nothing either. That was the first point she won. He knew it before the wagon ever left town. The road north of Pine Hollow narrowed quickly after the last row of houses. Cottonwoods stood bare along the creek, their branches rattling whenever the wind rose. Beyond them, the land opened into brown grass, low ridges, and distant mountains already white at the peaks. Rachel sat beside Daniel on the wagon seat, with both hands tucked beneath the lap blanket. For the first 10 minutes, she said nothing. Daniel respected that. Most people filled silence around him because it made them nervous. Rachel appeared perfectly willing to let it sit. At the junction where the road split toward the old silver workings, Daniel pointed with the reins. Mining camp is 6 miles east. Pine Hollow's south behind us. Red Mesa is another 12 minutes north. Rachel looked toward the mountains. How bad does the snow get? Depends on the year. That means bad. That means it depends on the year. She gave him a sideways look. Daniel kept his eyes on the horses. After another minute, Rachel asked, How many hands? 18 regular. 2 boys come and go depending on cattle work. Breakfast? Before daylight in winter. Dinner? Middle of the day if the cattle allow it. Supper? Usually 6. She nodded once. What shape is the kitchen in? Daniel did not answer quickly enough. Rachel turned toward him. That bad? It works. That is not the same thing. No. Range. Iron. Wood or coal? Wood. Pantry? Yes. She waited. Daniel glanced at her. What? You keep answering the smallest possible version of every question. It saves time. It also hides information. Daniel looked forward again. You'll see it soon enough. That bad, then? He heard the amusement in her voice. He decided not to answer. The Red Mesa gate appeared near dusk. 2 upright posts held a heavy crossbar with the ranch name carved into it, the letters darkened by years of weather. Beyond the gate stretched corrals, 2 barns, the bunkhouse, a blacksmith shed, and the main ranch house set farther up the rise. Smoke came from 3 chimneys. Rachel straightened slightly. Daniel noticed. Bigger than you expected? Yes. Problem? No. Another pause. Just means more mouths. Daniel almost smiled. Wade Thompson came out from the barn while they were unloading. He was 52, gray at the temples, lean from 30 years in the saddle, and suspicious of any change that had not been approved by weather and time. He stopped several yards away and looked at Rachel. Rachel looked back. Daniel introduced them. Wade Thompson, foreman. Rachel Turner. Wade nodded once. That your trunk? It usually is. Wade's eyebrows lifted. Daniel looked away to hide the beginning of a smile. Rachel noticed that too. The kitchen was reached through a side passage off the main house. Daniel opened the door and stepped aside. Rachel walked in, then stopped. He knew exactly what she was looking at. The shelves had not been properly organized in months. One flour sack leaned open in a corner. The work table had deep knife marks and a dark burn near one edge. A stack of pans sat crooked beside the sink basin. The range door hung slightly low on one hinge. Rachel said nothing. That worried Daniel more than complaining would have. She crossed the room, ran one finger over the table, opened the pantry, checked the flour, lifted the range door, looked behind it. Then she turned. How long since you had a proper cook? Daniel leaned against the doorframe. 3 months. That isn't what I asked. He studied her. Closer to a year. Rachel nodded as though confirming something to herself. All right. You can manage it? She looked around the room again. Yes. No drama. No speech. Just yes. Daniel found that more convincing than anything else she could have said. He showed her the small room over the washhouse where she would sleep. A narrow bed, one dresser, a washstand with a chipped white basin, a small iron stove in the corner. The window looked out toward the east pasture. Rachel set her gloves on the dresser. It's fine. Daniel nodded. Then came the part he had rehearsed in his head and still disliked saying. There's one more thing. Rachel turned. My daughter lives in the main house. Her name is Sophie. She's 7. Rachel waited. She doesn't speak. Daniel watched her face closely. No surprise large enough to be insulting. No pity. Just attention. She hasn't spoken regularly since her mother died. Rachel's eyes lowered for a second. I'm sorry. Daniel nodded. She doesn't do well with strangers asking questions, or trying to coax her into anything. I understand. If she comes near the kitchen, let her be. Rachel folded her coat over the back of the chair. I came here to bake bread, Mr. Mercer, not repair strangers. The words were blunt. Daniel should have disliked them. Instead, something in his shoulders eased. That's all I wanted to say. He turned toward the door. Mr. Mercer. He looked back. How long is the trial? 1 month. And after that? If it works, you stay. If it doesn't, I pay you through the month and the stage fare back to Pine Hollow. Rachel nodded. Fair terms. Daniel stepped into the hallway. As he reached the outside door, he heard Rachel move toward the window. He glanced back. She had gone still. Daniel followed her line of sight. Across the yard in the second-floor window of the main house, a small figure stood behind the curtain. Sophie. Only half her face was visible. She was looking directly at Rachel. Rachel did not wave, did not smile, did not move closer to the glass. She simply stood where she was and let the child look. After several seconds, the curtain shifted. Sophie disappeared. Daniel looked at Rachel. Rachel looked at him. Neither said anything. Then Rachel rolled up her sleeves. Where do you keep the lye soap? Daniel pointed toward the pantry. Bottom shelf. And the wood? Box outside. She nodded. Daniel opened the door. Behind him, he heard the scrape of a pan being lifted from the range. By the time he crossed the yard, the kitchen lamp was burning brighter. He told himself he had hired a baker for 1 month. Nothing more. Still, before he reached the barn, he glanced back once. Rachel Turner was standing in the kitchen window with her sleeves rolled up, studying the room like she meant to win an argument nobody had heard yet. Daniel had underestimated her. He was beginning to suspect that would not be the last time. Rachel did not sleep much that first night. The room over the wash-house was warmer than the stagecoach had been, but every board seemed to have its own opinion about the wind. The little iron stove clicked as it cooled. Somewhere below, a door slammed once and then stayed quiet. At 4:30, she lit the lamp. By 5, she was back in the kitchen. The room looked worse in daylight. Grease had hardened along the back edge of the range. One pantry shelf sagged under the weight of canned tomatoes and a crock of salt. Flour dust had worked into the cracks of the table until the wood looked permanently gray. Rachel tied on her apron and started with the stove. Lye soap, hot water, a stiff brush, then the shelves, then the flour. She found one sack damp at the bottom and carried it outside before the spoilage could spread. She saved what was dry, tied it off with clean cloth, and wrote the date on a scrap of paper with a kitchen pencil she found behind a jar. By 6, her shoulders were burning. By 6:15, the stove was hot enough to work. She mixed biscuits, nothing fancy. Flour, lard, salt, baking powder, cold water. Good food did not need to announce itself. It only needed to be right. The first ranch hands came in just before sunrise. Wade Thompson entered first. He stopped in the doorway. His eyes moved over the scrubbed table, the stacked plates, the coffee already poured into tin mugs. Then to Rachel, "You been up long?" "Long enough." He looked at the stove. "Range behaves bad." "I noticed." "Left side runs hot." "I noticed that too." Wade gave one short nod. Not approval. Not yet. Then Ben Carter came in behind him, stamping snow from his boots. He smelled the biscuits and smiled. That was quick. Rachel set a basket on the table. "You were expecting something slower?" Ben looked at Wade. Wade looked at his coffee. Ben decided to keep talking. "I just mean, first morning and all." Rachel handed him a plate. "Then you can be the first one to find out whether I know what I'm doing." That sounded fair to Ben. He sat. By the time Daniel entered, 6 men were already eating. The room had changed again. Not because anything had been redecorated, because nobody was talking much. Men who usually argued about horses or weather were focused on their plates. Daniel took his regular place. Rachel brought him coffee without asking how he took it. Black. He noticed. She noticed him noticing. Neither said anything. Ben reached for a third biscuit. Wade glanced at him. "You planning to leave any for the rest of us?" Ben looked offended. "I'm working today." "So are they." Rachel set down another basket. "Eat." Ben did. That was the whole exchange. By 8, every plate had come back clean. Rachel stood at the wash basin and watched the stack grow. It was not triumph. It was information. She had learned the first thing she needed to learn. They would eat what she made. The second thing took longer. The men were not cruel. Most of them were careful around her. Too careful. They said ma'am too often. They stepped out of her way before they needed to. They watched when she carried something heavy. It was the same kind of watching Rachel had seen in Kansas City. The polite kind that already expected failure. On the third morning, Ben stopped beside the pantry while Rachel wrestled a 50-pound flour sack onto the table. "You want a hand with that?" "No." "You sure?" "Yes." He lingered. Rachel looked at him. "Ben." "Yes, ma'am. If I need help, I'll ask." He raised both hands. All right. She lifted the sack the rest of the way. Ben watched her do it. Then he said, too casually, "Well, I reckon a woman built like you ought to be able to feed a whole county." The kitchen went still. Not completely. The coffee still simmered. A spoon clicked once against a plate. But every man near enough to hear stopped doing something. Wade looked up. Daniel, who had just entered through the main house door, stopped with one hand on the frame. Rachel kept both palms on the flour sack. For a second, Ben's face changed. He knew. Too late. Rachel turned toward him. She could have embarrassed him. She could have cut him badly enough with words to make sure nobody tried it again. A younger version of herself might have. Instead, she looked at the half-empty biscuit basket, then at Ben's plate. "You've eaten 6, she said. Ben blinked. "Yes, ma'am." So apparently the county is safe. A few men coughed into their coffee. Ben's ears went red. Rachel untied the flour sack. He stood there another second. Then he said quietly, "That came out wrong." Rachel looked up. "Yes. I'm sorry." She studied him. He looked genuinely uncomfortable. "Good. Then don't say it again." "I won't." She nodded. That was the end of it. Daniel stayed in the doorway longer than necessary. Later, after breakfast, he found Ben carrying wood into the kitchen without being asked. Rachel did not thank him extravagantly. She simply moved the empty box aside so he could set the new split logs in place. Daniel noticed that too. By the 4th morning, men were arriving early. Not all of them, but enough. Wade came in 10 minutes before breakfast and poured his own coffee while Rachel rolled biscuit dough. Ben came in 5 minutes later and said nothing until she handed him a plate. Then he said, "Morning." "Morning." No, ma'am. No careful politeness. Just morning. That was better. Rachel started learning names. Frank Dobbs liked his coffee strong enough to stain the cup. Isaac Bell never ate eggs unless the yolk was hard. Ben would eat almost anything. Wade drank 1 cup of coffee before speaking to anybody. Daniel ate quickly when he was worried, and slowly when he was tired. She noticed that last one without meaning to. She also noticed that he never asked whether the food was good. He simply ate. That should have irritated her. Instead, she began to understand that Daniel Mercer said very little about things he intended to keep. On the 5th day, the pantry latch finally gave out. Rachel opened the door, and the whole brass piece came loose in her hand. She stared at it, then at the shelf inside, then toward the main house. Daniel crossed the yard an hour later carrying a coil of rope. Rachel was outside shaking crumbs from a cloth. "Mr. Mercer." He stopped. "The pantry latch is broken." "I know." She waited. He shifted the rope to his other hand. "I've been meaning to fix it." "How long?" A pause. "Some time." Rachel nodded. Daniel narrowed his eyes slightly. "What?" "Nothing." That did not look like nothing. It looked like a man admitting he knows something is broken and still walking past it. He stared at her. She folded the cloth. Then she lifted another flour sack from the wagon bed. Daniel stepped forward automatically. "Here." Rachel held onto it. "I have it. I can see that." "Then why are you taking it?" "Because I'm standing here." She looked at him. He kept one hand under the sack but did not pull. For one brief second, they were both holding the same weight. Rachel let go first. Daniel carried it into the kitchen. He set it down near the table. She said, "If you want to be useful, fix the latch." He looked toward the pantry. Then back at her. "You always this direct?" "When people ask me twice." He almost smiled. This time she saw it happen. It was small, there and gone. Daniel went to the tool shed. 20 minutes later, he returned with a screwdriver, a small hammer, and a new brass latch he found in a drawer full of spare hardware. Rachel kept working while he crouched at the pantry door. The screwdriver slipped once. He muttered something under his breath. Rachel looked over. Problem? No. That sounded like a problem. It's a stubborn screw. You could ask for help. Daniel looked up at her. Rachel's face was perfectly straight. He shook his head and went back to the latch. She turned toward the stove before he could see her smile. When he finished, he opened and closed the pantry door twice. Solid. Rachel tested it herself. Good. Daniel wiped his hands on his trousers. That all? For now. He stood. Neither moved for a moment. The kitchen smelled of yeast and wood smoke. Outside, horses stamped in the cold yard. Daniel glanced toward the rising dough beneath its cloth. You making bread? Yes. For supper? Yes. He nodded once. Then he left. Rachel watched him cross the yard through the window. He stopped halfway to the barn and looked back. She turned away before he could catch her watching. That afternoon, the first loaves came out of the oven. The crusts were darker than she wanted on the left side. She had expected that. She rotated the second batch earlier. Those came out right. At supper, Wade cut into one while it was still warm. Steam rose from the center. He spread butter across a slice and ate without speaking. Ben waited. Frank waited. Rachel pretended not to. Wade chewed. Then he reached for another piece. That was enough. By the end of the week, the kitchen no longer felt abandoned. The shelves were labeled. The knives were sharpened. The range was clean. The wood box stayed full more often than not. And the men no longer looked at Rachel Turner like a temporary problem Daniel had hired for 1 month. Not all of them trusted her. Not yet. But they came early. They ate. They asked for seconds. Rachel let the bread answer. One morning before sunrise, she turned from the oven and saw someone standing in the doorway. Not Ben, not Wade, not Daniel. Sophie, barefoot, silent, watching. Sophie stood just beyond the kitchen doorway with one hand wrapped around the edge of the frame. Rachel did not turn toward her fully. She had already learned enough about the girl to know that being noticed too quickly might send her back upstairs. So Rachel kept working. The room was still dark beyond the lamps. Dawn had not yet reached the eastern ridge, and the kitchen windows were black mirrors reflecting the stove fire and the pale outline of flour on the table. Rachel pressed both hands into a mound of dough. Fold, turn, press. Behind her, the floorboard near the doorway gave one soft creak. Sophie had moved closer. Rachel said nothing. She reached for the flour tin, dusted the work surface, and divided the dough into equal pieces for breakfast rolls. One piece was too small. Normally, she would have folded it back into the larger batch. Instead, she left it on the corner of the table. Then she turned to check the coffee. The room stayed quiet. Rachel lifted the lid from the pot. Steam rose. She counted to 10 without looking behind her. There was a faint scrape, then nothing. When Rachel finally turned back, the small piece of dough was gone. Sophie was gone too. Rachel looked at the empty corner of the table. She smiled once to herself and went back to work. The next morning, Sophie appeared again. This time, she stood closer to the light. Her hair was unbraided, falling over the shoulders of her nightgown. She had pulled wool stockings over her feet, but wore no shoes. Rachel looked down once at the stone floor. Cold. She almost told Sophie to go put on slippers. She stopped herself. Instead, Rachel set another piece of dough on the table. Sophie stared at it. Rachel went to the pantry. When she returned, the dough had changed shape. It was stretched long through the middle, pinched narrow at one end, with 4 uneven legs pressed beneath it. A horse, or something close. Rachel studied it. Sophie stood in the doorway again, watching to see what she would do. Rachel picked up the dough horse carefully. One of the legs sagged. She straightened it with the end of a spoon. Then she placed the little horse on the corner of a baking sheet with the breakfast rolls. Sophie's eyes followed every movement. Rachel slid the tray into the oven. "That one might run sideways," she said, not looking at Sophie. No answer. She had not expected one. When the rolls were finished, Rachel took the little horse out last. It had puffed in the middle. One leg had fused into the body. Its head leaned backward at an impossible angle. Rachel set it on the kitchen windowsill to cool. Sophie waited. When Rachel turned toward the sink, she heard small footsteps. Then silence. She glanced sideways. The horse was gone. That became the beginning of something neither of them discussed. A rabbit appeared 2 mornings later. Rachel knew it was a rabbit because Sophie gave it 2 ears so long they nearly touched the baking sheet. Then a bird. Then a star. The star burned on one point because Rachel forgot to rotate the pan around the range's hot side. The next morning, Sophie placed another star on the table and pressed one finger into the burned corner of the old one. Rachel looked at her. Sophie looked back. "You noticed?" Rachel said. Sophie's eyes narrowed slightly. Rachel nodded. "Fair enough." She rotated the pan that morning. The second star came out evenly browned. Rachel left it on the windowsill. Sophie took it. By the end of the second week, the kitchen window held an entire line of little shapes. Not all of them disappeared. Some Sophie left behind. A horse with 1 ear. A round thing Rachel thought might be a sun. A crooked bird with wings too large for its body. Rachel began keeping those. She did not know why. Maybe because the windowsill looked less lonely with them there. Maybe because somebody had made them and trusted her not to laugh. Daniel noticed Sophie's new habit slowly. At first, he only knew that his daughter was waking earlier. He heard her bedroom door before daylight. Then the soft movement of feet across the upstairs hall. The first morning he followed, he stopped at the top of the stairs. Sophie was halfway down. She turned and saw him. The old stillness came back immediately. Daniel did not ask where she was going. He simply stepped aside. Sophie went downstairs. Daniel waited, then followed at a distance. From the hallway, he saw her in the kitchen doorway. Rachel stood at the table with her back turned, shaping biscuits. Sophie remained there, silent. Rachel reached for a scrap of dough and put it on the corner of the table without ceremony. Daniel understood. He backed away before either of them saw him. That evening he stood in the kitchen while Rachel prepared supper. She was cutting onions into a cast-iron skillet. Daniel looked toward the windowsill. 5 small baked shapes sat there. He picked up the horse with 1 ear. Rachel looked over. "Careful. That one's mean." Daniel turned it in his hand. "Sophie made this?" Rachel kept cutting. "She made all of them." Daniel looked at the row again. "She leaves some." "Yes." "Why?" Rachel slid the onions into the skillet. They hissed against the fat. "I don't know, you haven't asked?" "No." Daniel looked at her. Rachel added salt. "She'll tell me if she wants me to know." Daniel set the horse down carefully. "She hasn't made anything since Emily died." Rachel's knife stopped for half a second. then continued. She knew the name. Emily. He had not said it before. Not to her. Rachel did not ask what happened. Daniel seemed relieved by that. She used to draw, he said. Rachel waited. Horses, mostly. The skillet popped. Rachel turned the onions. She still likes horses. Daniel looked at the little figure. Apparently. They stood in silence for a while. Not uncomfortable, just unfinished. Then Rachel reached toward the pantry shelf. The latch is holding. Daniel glanced at it. Good. You put it in crooked. It closes. It closes crooked. Daniel looked at her. Rachel's face stayed straight. You planning to criticize every repair I make? Only the crooked ones. That saves me time. This time he smiled before he could stop himself. Rachel saw it. He knew she saw it. He looked back toward the windowsill. The horse with one ear sat between a star and the strange round sun. Do you keep them all? Only the ones she leaves. Why? Rachel wiped her knife. Same reason she leaves them, I suppose. Daniel raised an eyebrow. You just said you didn't know why she leaves them. I don't. Then that answer makes no sense. Rachel shrugged. It doesn't have to. Daniel gave a quiet breath that was almost a laugh. Then footsteps sounded in the hallway. Both of them turned. Sophie stood in the doorway. She wore a brown wool dress now, properly buttoned, with her hair braided neatly down her back. Her eyes went immediately to Daniel. Then the windowsill. Daniel understood the question. He stepped away from the little shapes. I was just looking. Sophie watched him another second. Then she crossed the threshold, all the way into the kitchen. Rachel did not react. Daniel did, not visibly. But his hand tightened against the back of the chair. Sophie walked to the table. There was no dough waiting. Rachel had already used the morning batch. Sophie looked at the empty corner, then at Rachel. Rachel looked at the flour bowl. She pinched off a small piece from the dough she had reserved for supper rolls and placed it down. Sophie took it immediately. Daniel stayed perfectly still. The girl began shaping. Her fingers worked slowly. A body, 4 legs, a long neck, another horse. Rachel went back to the stove. Daniel remained by the chair. For several minutes, the only sounds were the fire, the knife against the board, and Sophie's small fingers patting dough against wood. Then one of the horse's legs broke off. Sophie froze. Her hand hovered above it. Daniel knew that look. He had seen small problems become enormous inside her. He took half a step forward. Rachel lifted one finger. Not at Sophie. At him. Wait. Daniel stopped. Rachel reached for the flour tin and continued cooking. Sophie stared at the broken leg, then picked it up, pressed it back into place. It fell off again. Her mouth tightened. Rachel still did not move. Sophie tried a third time. This time she used a little water from the cup beside her. The leg held. Rachel glanced over. Smart. Sophie looked at her. Just for a second. But something in her face loosened. Daniel saw it. He lowered himself slowly into the chair behind him. Sophie finished the horse. Rachel baked it. When it came out, the repaired leg remained attached. Rachel set it on the windowsill. Sophie did not take it home. She left it there. Daniel looked at the horse for a long time. Later that night, after Sophie had gone upstairs, he came back to the kitchen. Rachel was washing the last pan. You didn't help her, he said. Rachel rinsed the soap away. She fixed it. You knew she would? No. Daniel leaned against the doorway. But you waited. Rachel dried her hands. She didn't ask me. Daniel looked at her for a long moment. You do that a lot. Do what? Wait. Rachel folded the towel over the edge of the basin. Sometimes people need room more than they need help. The words settled between them. Daniel looked toward the windowsill. The repaired horse stood in the middle of the others. Something made by his daughter. Something broken. Something she had chosen to repair herself. He reached for his hat. At the door he stopped. Good night, Rachel. It was the first time he had called her by her first name. Rachel noticed. Good night, Daniel. He looked back. Only once. Then he left. Rachel stood alone in the warm kitchen listening to his footsteps cross the hall. On the windowsill, the little horse leaned slightly to one side, but it stood. 3 days later, the weather turned. Wade saw it first. He came into the kitchen before breakfast, carrying cold with him, and set his coffee mug down harder than usual. Wind shifted north. Rachel looked toward the window. The sky beyond the glass was still dark. Snow by noon. Daniel came in behind him, already dressed for the yard. Heavy coat, gloves tucked into his belt, hat pulled low. How much? Wade shook his head. Enough. That was all the warning anyone at Red Mesa needed. By 8, men were hauling extra hay into the covered shed. Water troughs were checked. Loose boards were nailed down. Daniel sent 2 riders toward the south pasture to bring in cattle before the trail disappeared. Rachel worked without being told. She filled every available kettle, baked extra bread, set beans to soak, counted flour, salt pork, coffee, and lamp oil. Ben carried wood until the box was overflowing. You expecting us to eat the furniture after the bread runs out? He asked. Rachel pushed another loaf into the oven. If it comes to that, start with your chair. By 11, snow had begun falling sideways. Not soft flakes. Hard, dry grains driven against the house by wind strong enough to make the shutters knock. By afternoon, the mountains were gone. So was the road to Pine Hollow. The whole world beyond Red Mesa had narrowed to 30 yards of white. Daniel came through the kitchen twice, both times covered in snow, both times staying only long enough to warm his hands near the stove before going back out. On the 3rd trip, Rachel noticed blood on his sleeve. She put down the spoon she was holding. What happened? Not mine. That was worse. 2 men came in behind him carrying Frank Dobbs between them. Frank's face had gone pale beneath his beard. His right arm hung strangely against his body. Horse threw him near the north corral, Wade said. Landed hard. Rachel cleared the kitchen table in one sweep. Put him here. Frank managed a weak grin. Thought this was where we ate. Tonight, you're the roast. He laughed once and winced. Daniel looked at Rachel. You know anything about this? My aunt ran a boarding house. Men fell downstairs, cut hands, broke things. I know enough to keep him still until the storm lets up. Wade examined Frank's arm carefully. Looks broken clean. Rachel folded a blanket and placed it under the elbow. Daniel steadied Frank while Wade set a simple splint from smooth pieces of kindling wrapped in clean cloth. Frank swore once under his breath. Rachel handed him a leather strap. Bite that instead. He did. When it was finished, Daniel carried Frank to the downstairs sitting room near the main stove, where they could keep him warm. Rachel returned to the kitchen. Her hands were shaking slightly. She pressed them flat against the table, then went back to kneading dough. Daniel saw that. He said nothing. The storm continued through the night. By the second evening, the ranch had settled into the strange closeness bad weather creates. Nobody could leave. Nobody could pretend they did not need the others. Men played cards in the bunkhouse. Wade checked Frank every few hours. Rachel kept soup on the stove and coffee hot. Sophie spent more time near the kitchen door than usual. She did not make dough animals that day. She simply watched. Near 10, Daniel came in carrying an armful of wood. His sleeves were rolled to the elbows despite the cold. Rachel looked up from the table. "You already filled that box. Study's nearly empty. So this is theft. I own the wood. You own the ranch. I own this box." Daniel set the logs down. Temporary arrangement? Rachel considered him. One armful. Generous. The wind struck the west wall hard enough to rattle the pans. Both looked toward the ceiling. "Roof hold?" Rachel asked. "It's held through worse." "That is not comforting. It wasn't meant to be." He picked up 2 logs. Then the scream came. Daniel dropped one. Rachel was moving before she understood she had moved. The sound came again from the hallway. High. Broken. Not anger. Fear. Daniel reached the stairs first. Sophie. The girl came down so fast she nearly fell. Bare feet, white nightgown, hair loose. Her eyes were open, but seemed fixed on something none of them could see. Daniel caught her shoulders. "Sophie, it's me." She jerked away. Another cry tore out of her. Then she ran past him, into the kitchen, under the table. Daniel stopped. Rachel stopped too. Sophie folded herself against the wall beneath the work table, knees pulled tight to her chest, hands over her ears. Daniel lowered himself to the floor. "Sophie." She pressed harder against the wall. "Sweetheart, look at me." Her breathing only worsened. Daniel reached toward her. Sophie recoiled. His hand froze. Rachel saw his face, the helplessness in it. She knew that look. Not because she knew Sophie's grief, because everybody had something inside them that could not be dragged into daylight just because someone loved them enough to try. Rachel lowered herself to the floor several feet from the table. She did not look underneath. She sat with her back against the cupboard. Daniel glanced at her. Rachel raised one hand slightly. "Wait." Then she began talking. "I ruined a loaf once when I was 14. Daniel stared at her. Under the table, the breathing continued. Rachel looked at the stove. "Thought I knew everything. My aunt told me not to knock the dough around after the second rise. I knocked it around anyway." She rubbed flour from one palm with her thumb. Came out flat as a roof shingle. The breathing under the table hitched. Rachel continued. "Funny thing about dough. You can press it down. Punch the air clean out of it. Make it look like there's nothing left." Daniel lowered his hand. "But if it's still alive," Rachel said, "and you put it somewhere warm, and you leave it alone a while." She paused. The wind moaned in the chimney. "It rises again." Something shifted beneath the table. Rachel did not turn, not because anybody ordered it to. Another pause. Because that's what living things do when they finally get enough warmth. A small hand appeared at the table's edge. Daniel stopped breathing for a second. Rachel kept her eyes on the stove. Sophie crawled forward slowly. First one knee, then the other. She did not go toward Daniel. She came toward Rachel. Rachel stayed still. Sophie sat beside her. Close. Not touching. Then the wind struck the house again. Sophie flinched. Her shoulder moved against Rachel's arm. Rachel let it. Nothing more. No embrace. No reaching. Daniel sat on the floor opposite them with both hands loose over his knees. For several minutes, nobody spoke. Sophie's breathing slowed. Her hands fell away from her ears. Finally, her head tipped against Rachel's shoulder. Rachel looked at Daniel. His eyes were wet. He looked away first. When Sophie fell asleep, Daniel came closer. Rachel shifted carefully. He lifted the child into his arms. Sophie stirred once but did not wake. Daniel carried her upstairs. Rachel remained on the kitchen floor another moment. Then she got up, righted the chair Daniel had knocked aside, picked up the fallen log, put it on the fire. Her hands were trembling again. Daniel returned 15 minutes later. Rachel stood at the stove with her back to him. He did not come close. He took another log from the box and placed it into the fire. Sparks climbed the chimney. "You knew when not to reach for her," he said. Rachel kept her eyes on the flames. "So did you." "No." He rubbed one hand over his face. "I keep thinking if I can just get close enough." His voice stopped. Rachel waited. Daniel stared into the stove. "Emily died in a wagon accident," he said quietly. "Sophie was with her." Rachel's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. Daniel had never told her that much. The horses spooked on an icy grade. Wagon went over. Sophie lived. He swallowed. "I was 3 miles away." Rachel did not say it was not his fault. She did not know enough to give him that sentence, so she said nothing. Daniel seemed grateful. After a while, Rachel poured coffee into 2 mugs. She set one near him. He wrapped both hands around it. "You talk about bread a lot," he said. "It pays better than talking about people." That drew a tired breath from him, almost a laugh. They drank quietly. The storm pressed against the house, but inside the kitchen, the fire held. At some point, Daniel looked toward the windowsill. The repaired dough horse stood in the lamplight, still crooked, still upright. He looked at Rachel. She looked back. Neither moved closer. They did not need to. Not yet. Outside, snow sealed Red Mesa away from the rest of Colorado. Inside, for the first time in almost 2 years, Daniel no longer felt like he was carrying his daughter's silence entirely alone. The storm broke before dawn on the 3rd day. By noon, the sky had cleared into a hard blue, and sunlight flashed across drifts piled almost to the lower rails of the North Corral. Men shoveled paths between the bunkhouse, barn, and main house, while the horses pawed through crusted snow in the pens. Life at Red Mesa began moving again. Frank Dobbs remained inside with his arm splinted and tied close to his chest. He complained about being useless until Rachel threatened to put him to work peeling potatoes one-handed. He stopped complaining. Sophie came to the kitchen the next morning. No nightmare, no tears. She simply appeared in the doorway, placed a small piece of dough on the table, and began making another horse. Daniel passed through on his way outside. He saw her. He saw Rachel deliberately keep her attention on the biscuits, and he kept walking. That was new. A week later, Rachel noticed something else. The meat delivery was short. She stood beside the pantry table with the butcher's receipt in one hand and the wrapped cuts in front of her. 6 pounds less beef than the previous week, 4 pounds less salt pork. She checked the receipt again. Same number of men. Same weather. Less food. When Wade came in for coffee, Rachel held up the paper. Did the butcher forget part of the order? Wade's eyes went to the receipt. No. Then Daniel changed it. Wade took his coffee. That's ranch business. Rachel looked at the meat. It becomes kitchen business when I'm expected to stretch it through 20 men. Wade drank. Rachel waited. He was good at silence. So was she. Finally he said, "Stretch it." Then he left. Rachel did. Beans went farther with less pork if they cooked slowly. Gravy made a small roast feed more men. Bread filled the space meat could not. Nobody went hungry. But Rachel kept watching. 2 days later, the farrier came to shoe 3 horses. Daniel sent him away after 1. A broken hinge on the tack room door remained broken. A wagon wheel that should have gone to the wheelwright was patched by Wade with iron strapping and a mallet. Then Rachel found 3 supply receipts tucked beneath the flour ledger. She had not been snooping. They were where kitchen papers were kept. Coffee, molasses, flour, lard, each order smaller than the last. She sat at the table after supper and ran the numbers twice. Daniel came in near 9. He stopped when he saw the papers. Rachel looked up. "Before you say anything, these were in my ledger. They shouldn't have been." But they were. Daniel crossed the room. His coat was still on. Snow had melted dark along the shoulders. He looked at the receipts, then at her pencil marks. "You keeping accounts now?" "I've always kept accounts." "For the kitchen, this is the kitchen." He pulled out a chair but did not sit. Rachel tapped one receipt. "You're buying less every week. We've had losses." "Cattle?" His eyes changed slightly. "That was enough. How many?" "Rachel." "How many?" He put both hands on the chair back. "This isn't something you need to worry about." She leaned back. That sentence usually means somebody has already worried about it too long. Daniel's jaw tightened. For a moment the old distance came back. Employer. Employee. Ranch owner. Baker. "I hired you to run the kitchen, and I am running it." "Then run it." Rachel went still. Daniel heard himself too late. He looked away. The stove ticked softly behind them. Rachel gathered the receipts into a neat stack. "All right." Something about the quiet way she said it bothered him more than an argument would have. He rubbed a hand over the back of his neck. "I didn't mean you did." He looked at her. Rachel placed the papers beside the ledger. "You meant that there's a line and I stepped over it." Daniel exhaled. "Yes." "Fine." She stood. "But if you keep cutting supplies, tell me before I plan meals around food that isn't coming. That's fair." "Yes." She walked toward the pantry. Daniel remained beside the chair. Then he said, 37 head. Rachel stopped. He sat down. "We lost 37 head in the fall. Lung sickness went through the east herd. Another 11 were too weak to sell at full price." Rachel turned back. Daniel stared at the table. "Winter feed cost more than I expected. Spring note comes due before the first large cattle sale." "How large a note?" His eyes lifted. She raised one hand. "You don't have to tell me." He looked at the kitchen around them, at the labeled shelves, the clean stove, the flour ledger. Then he gave her the number. Rachel sat slowly. It was worse than she expected. Not ruined tomorrow, but close enough that a bad spring could finish what the sickness had started. For several minutes, she said nothing. Daniel watched her calculate. He had seen that look before, when she measured flour without a scale. "What?" Rachel looked toward the cooling rack. "People in Pine Hollow bought 24 rolls from me last Saturday." Daniel frowned. "When?" "When Ben drove me in for molasses." "You sold bread?" "I traded 12. "Sold 12. To who?" Mrs. Cooper at the hotel. Daniel leaned back. Rachel opened the flour ledger to a blank page. She asked if I could bring more. You're already feeding this ranch. I know. The kitchen is enough work. I know that too. She began writing. Daniel watched. What are you doing? Thinking. On paper? It keeps the thinking from lying. She wrote the cost of flour, lard, yeast, wood. Then the price Mrs. Cooper had paid per loaf. The mining camp east of town has what, 80 men? Closer to 120 this winter. Do they have a baker? A cook? That wasn't my question. Daniel almost smiled despite himself. Rachel continued. Hotel takes bread. Mining camp might take bread. Biscuits travel badly, but pies don't if they're packed right. You're proposing to run a bakery out of my ranch kitchen. I'm proposing to find out if people will pay for what I'm already making. Daniel's expression hardened again. No. Rachel stopped writing. No what? I'm not taking your labor to cover my debt. She stared at him. That isn't what I said. It's what it becomes. No. Rachel. She pushed the ledger across the table. Then don't use me. Daniel looked down at it. Make me a partner. Silence. The words stayed between them. Rachel pointed to the figures. Red Mesa supplies the kitchen, wood, wagon runs, and part of the flour. I do the baking and keep the accounts. We split the profit after costs. Daniel said nothing. My share goes into a separate account, Rachel continued. Mine. Toward a bakery someday. His eyes lifted to hers. That's what you want? Yes. A bakery. One with my name on the sign. Something in the way she said it made him stop asking questions, not because the answer was simple, because it clearly was not. And Red Mesa gets the other share, he said. Yes. You drew this up already? I started 5 minutes ago. Daniel picked up the ledger. Rachel waited. He read every figure. Asked about flour waste. Asked about transportation. Asked how much production the stove could handle without interfering with ranch meals. Rachel answered each question. When she didn't know, she said so. That impressed him more than certainty would have. Finally, Daniel stood. I want Wade to look at the numbers. Good. And Cooper has to agree to regular orders. Obviously. And you don't work yourself sick doing it. Rachel raised an eyebrow. That part sounds less like business. It's still a condition. Then write it. Daniel looked at her. Rachel slid a clean sheet of paper across the table. If we're partners, write the terms. The next morning they did. Not a handshake. Paper. Daniel wrote the agreement at his study desk in black ink while Rachel sat opposite him. The split. The costs. Her wages unchanged. Her share of bakery profits separately recorded as her property. He finished and turned the paper around. Rachel read every line. Twice. Daniel waited without impatience. Anything wrong? He asked. No. Anything you want changed? She looked at him. No. He handed her the pen. Rachel signed. Rachel Turner. Daniel signed beneath it. Daniel Mercer. He sanded the ink and shook the excess back into the small tin. Then he gave her the original. She looked at the paper. You keep it. It's yours too. You keep the copy. Rachel lifted her eyes. You're giving me the original? Yes. A pause. Why? Daniel's face tightened slightly, not with anger. Because your name is on it. Rachel folded the paper carefully. No man had ever said those particular words to her, as if they settled the matter. She slipped the agreement into the inner pocket of her apron. Daniel stood. "That make us partners?" "Not yet." He looked confused. Rachel nodded toward the door. "First we have to sell the bread." The corner of his mouth moved. "All right, partner." Rachel looked away before he could see what the word did to her. Outside the study, a floorboard creaked. They both turned. Sophie stood in the hall holding a little dough horse in both hands. She looked at Rachel, then Daniel, then at the paper disappearing into Rachel's apron. Rachel held out her hand. Sophie crossed the room and placed the horse into it. Daniel watched the exchange. Rachel set the little horse carefully beside the signed ledger. For once, nobody needed to explain what it meant. The bread business began with 12 loaves. Mrs. Cooper at the Pine Hollow Hotel bought 6. The mining camp took 4. 2 more went to the general store, where they were gone before noon. The following week, Mrs. Cooper asked for 10. By the 3rd week, Rachel had a separate notebook for outside orders. Each page ruled in pencil, with names, quantities, prices, and delivery days. The numbers were still small, but they moved in the right direction. Daniel never asked what she did with her share. He simply made sure Wade entered it separately. That mattered to Rachel more than she expected. One cold morning in January, a widow named Maggie Price came to the kitchen door with a boy hiding behind her skirt. Maggie was 26, thin from too many skipped meals, with a patched gray coat and red hair escaping beneath a knitted cap. "Mrs. Cooper said you might need help." Rachel looked at the boy. He was maybe 5 with a runny nose and one mitten missing. "What's his name?" "Tommy." "Can he stay out from under the stove?" Maggie almost smiled. "Most days." Rachel stepped aside. "Come in." That was how Maggie began. She did not know bread, but she knew work. Rachel taught her how to measure flour by weight when the scale behaved, by feel when it did not. How to tell when dough had enough water. How to rotate pans before the left side of the iron range scorched the bottoms. Tommy spent mornings on a stool near the wall with scraps of dough and strict instructions not to throw flour. He broke that rule twice. Sophie noticed him on the 2nd day. Rachel heard the familiar stair creak, then silence. Tommy looked toward the doorway. Sophie stood there. He stared. She stared back. Finally, Tommy held up a dough snake. "Horse," he said. Rachel looked over. It was clearly not a horse. Sophie's mouth twitched. That became their introduction. Within 2 weeks, Sophie had begun coming farther into the kitchen whenever Tommy was there. She still did not speak, but she sat at the end of the table. She took dough when Rachel offered it. Once, Tommy handed her a wooden spoon and declared, "You stir." Sophie took it. Daniel came through the doorway at that exact moment and stopped. Rachel saw him. He saw Sophie. Neither said anything. Daniel took his coffee and left, but he walked more slowly than usual. The winter social in Pine Hollow was announced on a Monday. Wade brought the notice back from town and pinned it beside the kitchen door. Saturday, January 28th. Supper and dancing. Town hall. Musicians from Fort Collins. Ben read it aloud while eating a biscuit. "You going, Miss Turner?" Rachel did not look up from the pie crust. "No." "Why not?" "I'm delivering 6 pies." "That sounds like going." "That sounds like delivering 6 pies." Ben frowned as though this distinction personally offended him. Maggie glanced toward Rachel but said nothing. Daniel entered just in time to hear the end of it. "Cooper ordered all 6? 4 apple, 2 molasses." Daniel nodded. "You'll need the wagon." Ben already volunteered. Ben looked surprised. "I did?" Rachel looked at him. You're volunteering now. Ben grinned. Apparently I am. Daniel's eyes stayed on Rachel a second longer. You're not staying? I have bread to start before dawn. He accepted the answer, at least outwardly. Saturday arrived clear and bitter. The road to Pine Hollow had frozen hard enough that wagon wheels rang against the ruts. Rachel wrapped the pies in clean cloth and packed them into wooden crates with towels wedged between the pans. Maggie insisted she wear her better dress. It'll wrinkle under your coat anyway. I'm not staying. You've said that enough times to make me suspicious. Rachel ignored her. The dress was dark blue wool, plain except for small pearl-colored buttons at the throat. It fit her closely through the waist and fell heavily over her hips. Rachel stood before the small wash-house mirror longer than she intended. Then she pulled on her coat. Pine Hollow's town hall had been decorated with pine boughs and lanterns. Horses crowded the hitching rails outside. Music drifted through the walls before Rachel even reached the door. Inside, the room smelled of coffee, wool, lamp oil, roast meat, and too many people in one place. Rachel delivered the pies to Mrs. Cooper. That should have been the end of it. Then Maggie appeared. Rachel stared at her. You followed me? Daniel brought us. Rachel turned. Daniel stood near the entrance with Sophie beside him. He wore a dark coat Rachel had never seen before, cleaner than his ranch clothes, with a black necktie that looked as though somebody else had tied it. Sophie wore a green dress and held Daniel's hand. Rachel's chest tightened unexpectedly. Daniel looked at her, then at the blue dress, then back to her face. He said nothing. That was somehow worse. Rachel busied herself checking the pie table. The dancing began after supper. A fiddle, banjo, and upright piano crowded into one corner while couples moved across the plank floor. Rachel stayed near Maggie. She watched Ben attempt to impress a blacksmith's daughter. He failed badly. She was smiling at that when two women stopped near the coat pegs behind her. Neither realized Rachel could hear. Mercer looks better tonight. He always did. He ought to marry again. Someone suitable. A little laugh, not that, Baker. Rachel's hand stilled around her coffee cup. The second woman lowered her voice, but not enough. He may like what comes out of her oven, but I can't imagine Daniel Mercer choosing that much woman when half the county would have him. Maggie heard. Rachel knew because Maggie's jaw tightened. She started to turn. Rachel touched her wrist. No. Rachel, no. Rachel set down her cup. I should go. You just got here. I delivered the pies. She crossed toward the coat pegs. Her fingers were steady until she reached for her coat. Then they were not. She hated that. Not the women. The fact that two careless sentences could still reach places she thought she had boarded shut. She got one arm into the coat. Leaving? Daniel stood several feet away. Rachel kept her eyes on the buttons. Early morning. You always have an early morning. That's how mornings work. He studied her. What happened? Nothing. His eyes shifted briefly past her, toward the two women. Rachel saw him understand. Her shoulders stiffened. Don't. I haven't said anything. You were about to, no. She looked at him. Daniel held out one hand. Dance with me. Rachel stared. What? One dance, no. He lowered his hand. All right. That surprised her. He waited a moment, then said, I'm going to ask one more time. Rachel's mouth tightened. Why? Because I want to. The music shifted into a slower reel. Daniel held her gaze. If you say no again, I won't ask a third time. No pressure, no audience in his voice, just a choice placed between them. Rachel looked toward the floor, then toward Sophie. The girl stood beside Maggie, watching. Rachel looked back at Daniel. Yes. He offered his hand again. This time she took it. His palm was rough and warm. They stepped onto the dance floor. Rachel discovered within 30 seconds that Daniel Mercer was a terrible dancer. He knew the pattern. His feet simply refused to cooperate with it. He stepped on her shoe once, then nearly collided with Ben. Rachel bit her lip. Daniel noticed. Go ahead. What? Laugh. I'm trying not to. Why? You're my employer. Partner. That did it. Rachel laughed. A real laugh. Daniel looked at her and missed the next step entirely. You're making it worse, Joe, she said. You're distracting me. I'm standing where you put me. That may be the problem. She laughed again. Then, over Daniel's shoulder, she saw Sophie. The child was grinning, not the tiny, almost smile from the supper table. A full grin. Her eyes bright. Her shoulders lifted as though she were holding back laughter of her own. Rachel stopped. Daniel followed her gaze. He stopped too. For a moment they simply watched. Sophie looked at them. Then Daniel stepped backward directly onto Ben Carter's boot. Ben yelped. Sophie covered her mouth, her whole face lit. Rachel laughed so hard she had to catch Daniel's arm. Daniel looked down at her, and for several seconds he forgot the room, forgot the music, forgot the women by the coats, forgot even that Sophie was watching. Rachel's hand rested against his sleeve. Her cheeks were flushed. Her eyes were wet with laughter. Daniel had seen her tired, angry, concentrating, covered in flour. He had never seen her like this. Rachel noticed the way he was looking. The laughter faded slowly. Neither moved. Then Daniel loosened his grip, not letting go, just giving her room. The music ended. Rachel stepped back. Thank you, she said. Daniel nodded. For the dance? For asking twice. Something changed in his face. He understood. Only twice, he said. Rachel looked toward Sophie. The girl was still smiling. Outside, the night had gone clear and bitter. Stars scattered over the dark Colorado mountains. Rachel had arrived planning to deliver pies and leave unnoticed. Instead, she rode back to Red Mesa with Sophie asleep under a blanket beside her, Daniel holding the reins, and the warmth of his hand still lingering in her palm. She did not yet know that a letter was already making its way west from Kansas, a letter with her name on the envelope, and a past she had believed was finished. It arrived 4 days after the winter social. Pete brought the mail in from Pine Hollow just before noon, dropping a small bundle of folded notices and receipts on the kitchen table beside Rachel's flower ledger. Something for you? He said. Rachel looked up from the dough. Most of her mail now came from Mrs. Cooper at the hotel or from the mining camp manager, asking for more bread than she could reasonably produce without adding another oven. The envelope was different. Cream paper. Good quality. Her name written in a hand she knew immediately. Rachel Turner. No ranch name. No Pine Hollow. Just her. For a moment the kitchen sounds seemed to recede. The scrape of Maggie's knife against the cutting board. Tommy humming to himself beneath the table. The soft pop of wood in the stove. Rachel wiped both hands carefully on her apron before touching the envelope. Maggie looked over. You all right? Yes. The answer came too quickly. Rachel slipped the letter into her apron pocket. I'll read it later. She did not. Not immediately. She worked through dinner, counted the loaves bound for town, checked 2 pie orders, corrected Tommy when he tried to feed a lump of raw dough to the ranch cat. Only after Maggie left with the boy and the kitchen settled into its afternoon quiet did Rachel finally sit down. The envelope felt heavier than paper should. She broke the seal. Henry Sloane had always written neatly. That had been one of the things people liked about him. Neat clothes, neat ledgers, neat explanations, nothing spilled outside the margins. Rachel read the first line, "Dear Rachel, I was surprised to hear that you have begun doing business in Colorado under a name and with recipes that belong to our family." Her eyes stopped. She read it again, then continued. Henry had seen an advertisement in a Kansas City paper reprinted from a Colorado business column. Turner's Red Mesa Bread. Orders available through Pine Hollow Hotel. He wrote that he had no desire to embarrass her. That sentence almost made her laugh. Henry only used words like embarrass when he had already decided embarrassment was useful. He reminded her that the bakery recipes had been developed under Aunt Caroline's roof. He reminded her that the equipment and savings from the Kansas City business had been settled as part of the estate. Then he came to the point. He claimed Rachel had taken money that was not hers when she left. He claimed the recipe ledger belonged to the estate, and he claimed she had signed away any right to use the family business material independently. Rachel's fingers went cold. There was a second sheet, a copy. Her signature appeared near the bottom. Rachel Turner. She recognized it, but not the paragraph above it. She read the document slowly. Assignment of business interest, transfer of recipes, trade knowledge, and related property. Release of future claim. Her stomach tightened. She remembered that week. Aunt Caroline had been dead 3 days. The bakery smelled wrong without her. Not bad. Wrong. Customers came in speaking softly, as though the oven itself was grieving. Henry had arrived wearing a black coat and carrying a stack of papers. Estate inventory, bank forms, sale authorization, receipts. Things Rachel barely understood and had been too tired to challenge. Sign here and here. This one confirms you've received what you're owed. She had asked him what she was signing. He had looked tired and irritated. Just routine papers, Rachel. Do you want me to handle this or not? She had signed. Then he sold the bakery. The business she had worked in for 11 years disappeared in less than a month. Her share, Henry had told her, was nothing beyond her final wages because Aunt Caroline had never formally made her a partner. Rachel had left Kansas City with one trunk, $73, and the recipe ledger she had kept since she was 19. Henry had not stopped her from taking that. Until now. The kitchen door opened. Rachel folded the letter quickly. Daniel came in carrying a coil of rawhide. He took one look at her and stopped. What happened? Nothing. Daniel's eyes moved to the paper. Rachel hated how easily he saw through that answer now. He set the rawhide on the bench. Rachel. She stood. I need to finish the afternoon batch. He did not move closer. That helped. She picked up the dough scraper. Her hand shook once against the table. Daniel noticed. Is it from Kansas? Rachel looked up. He remembered. Of course he remembered. She let out a slow breath. Yes. Family? My cousin. Daniel waited. Rachel set the scraper down, then handed him the letter. He read it standing beside the table. His face changed little, but she knew enough by now to notice the stillness that came over him when something angered him. He read the copied document next. You signed this? I signed something. That isn't what I asked. I know. Daniel looked up. Rachel crossed both arms tightly. I don't remember that language, but the signature is mine. Were you given a copy? No. Did anyone explain it? No. He looked back at the document. Then it may not mean what he's claiming. Rachel gave a short breath. You sound like a lawyer. I sound like a man who doesn't trust a paper somebody produces years later when money starts appearing. She turned away. The oven heat pressed against her face. He says I stole the recipes. Did you? No. Then start there. She looked back at him sharply. You think it's that simple? No. His answer came quietly. Rachel's shoulders dropped half an inch. Daniel put the letter down. What does he want? The last paragraph answered that. Henry intended to travel west. He would seek an accounting of all profits generated from the recipes and name Red Mesa Ranch in the claim because the ranch had benefited financially from what he considered family property. Daniel read that section twice. Rachel watched him. There it was. The part she had feared before she even finished the letter. Not herself. Red Mesa. The ranch. Daniel. Sophie. Everything she had begun to touch. I can stop using the name, Rachel said. Daniel looked up. What? Turner's Red Mesa bread. I can stop. We can suspend the orders until I know what this is. No. She stiffened. Daniel. We're not shutting down because your cousin wrote a threatening letter. If he's right about the paper. Is he? I don't know, then don't surrender before you know. Rachel's voice sharpened. This isn't only my business anymore. That's the problem. Daniel's gaze held steady. No. That's the point. She stared at him. We signed an agreement. I remember. Red Mesa gets half the profit after costs. Yes. If Henry claims that profit came from something I had no right to use, he can drag you into it. Then he drags me. Rachel stepped back. You say that like it costs nothing. I didn't say that. You have a ranch already carrying debt. I know exactly what I have, and I won't be the reason you lose more. Daniel went quiet. Rachel heard her own breathing. Too fast. She forced it slower. Daniel picked up the copied document again. What was your aunt's full name? Rachel blinked. What? Your aunt. Caroline Turner. Did she keep records? Of course she kept records. Where? The bakery. House ledger too, I think. Who handled the estate besides Henry? Rachel hesitated. Mrs. Harper helped Aunt Caroline with books sometimes. Louise Harper. She rented an upstairs room for years. Is she still alive? I don't know. Daniel folded the papers carefully. Rachel watched him. What are you doing? Looking for facts. He placed the letter back on the table. Rachel almost laughed, but there was nothing funny in her. You don't have to take this on. Daniel's face hardened slightly. There it is again. What? That thing you do. Rachel stared. You decide what other people are allowed to risk. That is not what I'm doing. No. No. She pushed away from the table. I am trying to keep my trouble from becoming yours. Daniel looked at the signed partnership agreement tucked beneath the ledger. Too late. The words landed harder than he intended. Rachel went still. Daniel saw it. He softened his voice. I mean, the business is already ours. The ranch share. Your share. The orders. We agreed to it together. Rachel looked at him. He did not reach for her. did not tell her not to worry, did not promise he would fix it. He simply stood there, present. "I need to think," she said. Daniel nodded. "Then think." He picked up the rawhide and went to the door. At the threshold, he stopped. "Rachel." She looked up. "He hasn't taken anything yet." Then he left. Rachel remained beside the table. Outside, the afternoon sun shone hard across the snow. A wagon moved somewhere near the barn. Maggie's boy had left one wooden horse beneath the bench. Ordinary things. Solid things. Rachel sat again. She opened Henry's letter one more time. This time she read past the legal language and found something she had missed. A sentence near the end. "I will arrive in Pine Hollow before the first week of February and expect this matter to be settled without public unpleasantness." Rachel looked at the date. 9 days. Henry was already traveling. She stood so quickly the chair legs scraped the floor. Sophie appeared in the doorway. Rachel froze. The girl looked at her, then at the letter. Rachel folded it. "It's all right." Sophie did not move. Rachel realized she had said the words automatically. The same words people said when they wanted a thing to be true. She lowered herself into the chair. "No," she corrected quietly. "It isn't all right yet." Sophie watched. Rachel held out her hand. Not toward the child, toward the dough bowl. "Want to make something?" After a moment, Sophie crossed the kitchen. Rachel pinched off a small piece and set it between them. Sophie began shaping it. A horse again. Rachel looked down at Henry's letter. 9 days. For the first time since coming to Red Mesa, the road east no longer felt like something behind her. It felt like it was coming toward her. Henry Sloan arrived in Pine Hollow on a Tuesday afternoon. Rachel did not see him ride in. She heard about him from Mrs. Cooper. The hotel owner came to Red Mesa herself the next morning in a small sleigh with a blanket wrapped over her knees and irritation written plainly across her face. "He's asking questions." Rachel stopped rolling pie dough. "What kind?" "The polite kind." That was worse. Mrs. Cooper removed her gloves and set them beside the flour ledger. "He asked how long I've been buying from you, what I pay, whether Daniel provided the money to start the operation." Daniel, who had been standing near the stove with a coffee mug, lowered it. "What did you tell him?" "That the bread is good and my accounts are my business." Rachel almost smiled. Mrs. Cooper continued. "He was charming about it." Rachel's smile disappeared. Of course he was. Henry was always most dangerous when he was charming. He knew how to make concern sound reasonable, how to make accusations sound like disappointment, how to make other people feel clever for agreeing with him. "What else?" Rachel asked. Mrs. Cooper hesitated. "He says you were confused after your aunt died." Daniel's jaw tightened. Rachel kept her hands flat on the table. "He says you never understood the business arrangement properly." That sounds like him. He also says he would prefer to settle privately. Rachel looked at the window. Outside, Sophie and Tommy were dragging a wooden crate through the snow as if it were a sled. Maggie stood near the kitchen door watching them. Ordinary morning. Ordinary ranch. Henry had been in town one night and already the air felt different. Mrs. Cooper reached across the table and touched Rachel's wrist. "I haven't canceled anything." Rachel nodded. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Half Pine Hollow will have heard his version by supper." She was right. By Friday, the general store reduced its regular order. Not canceled. Reduced. The owner, Mr. Hale, looked miserable when Rachel came in with the bread. "My wife likes it," he said too quickly. "Everybody likes it. But..." He rubbed the back of his neck. But until this business about ownership is settled, I can't be in the middle. Rachel stared at the 6 loaves he no longer wanted. Pete stood beside her, saying nothing. Mr. Hale shifted his weight. I've got a store to protect. Rachel picked up the crate. I understand. She did understand. That did not make it hurt less. On the way back, Pete drove while Rachel sat with the returned loaves under a blanket between her boots. The road was hard and white. Fence posts stood black against the snow. Pete finally said, "He came into the livery yesterday." Rachel looked at him. "Henry?" He asked about Mr. Mercer. "What about him? Whether Red Mesa is carrying debt?" Rachel's fingers tightened around the edge of the seat. Pete glanced at her. "I didn't tell him anything." "I know, he already knew some." That was the part that frightened her. By the time the Red Mesa gate came into view, Rachel had made a decision she had been trying not to make. The formal notice arrived the next day. A local attorney in Pine Hollow had filed Henry's petition with the territorial court. The language was careful: accounting of profits, claimed misuse of business property, potential recovery from any party benefiting from disputed recipes or trade materials. Daniel read the notice once, then again. Rachel watched him from the other side of the kitchen table. Wade stood near the door with his arms crossed. "How bad?" he asked. Daniel set the paper down. "Bad enough to waste time and money." Rachel looked at him. "There." Daniel's eyes lifted. "Don't. You said yourself I said it will cost money. I did not say you should leave." Wade glanced between them. Rachel looked away first. That night, she packed. Not much. There had never been much. 2 dresses, her better blue one from the dance, aprons, a wool shawl, the account notebook that held only her share, her aunt's recipe pages wrapped in cloth. She stood beside the open trunk in the wash-house room for a long time. The bed was neatly made. Daniel had repaired the window sash 2 weeks earlier after cold air began slipping through one corner. She had never asked him to. She touched the repaired wood once, then shut the trunk. Her plan was simple: leave before dawn, take the stage south, return Henry's disputed materials if necessary, let him chase her somewhere that did not belong to Daniel. She carried the trunk downstairs quietly. The kitchen was dark except for the low glow from the banked stove. Rachel set the trunk beside the back door. Then she heard a floorboard. Sophie stood in the interior doorway. Rachel froze. The girl looked at the trunk, then at Rachel. Rachel forced her voice steady. "You should be asleep." Sophie did not move. "It's early." Still nothing. Rachel crossed toward the stove. Sophie backed away. Not upstairs. Toward the hall. "Sophie." The girl turned and ran. Rachel closed her eyes. Wonderful. Less than 5 minutes later, the front door opened hard enough to strike the wall. Daniel came into the kitchen wearing trousers, boots, and an unbuttoned shirt beneath his coat. His hair was uncombed. He saw the trunk. Then Rachel. "What are you doing?" Rachel folded both hands in front of her. "Leaving." "No." The word came too quickly. She stiffened. Daniel stopped himself. His voice changed. "Why? You know why." "No. I know why you think you should." Rachel laughed once without humor. "Merchants are already backing away. Henry has filed against the ranch. He's asking about your debt." "That doesn't answer me. I am the reason." "You're not." "Daniel." The reason is Henry. He wouldn't be here without me. Daniel crossed halfway into the room and stopped, leaving several feet between them. Rachel noticed. Even angry, he stopped. "This is my trouble," she said. "No." Her eyes flashed. "You do not get to tell me what belongs to me." The words landed hard. Daniel went still. Rachel's breathing changed. She had meant the lawsuit, but they both heard the larger thing beneath it. Daniel nodded once. "You're right." That disarmed her more than an argument would have. He continued quietly. "It is your trouble." Rachel looked toward the trunk. "And I will deal with it." "You can." She looked back. "But you can choose to leave, Rachel. You don't get to choose whether I stand beside you." Silence. The stove settled with a soft metallic tick. Rachel stared at him. "I am trying to protect Red Mesa. By disappearing? By taking away Henry's reason to come after it. What makes you think he'll stop?" "He wants me. He wants leverage." Daniel's voice stayed low. "If you leave, he learns that threatening what you care about works." Rachel's face tightened. "That is not fair." "No. You think I don't know what leaving costs? I think you know it too well." That one hurt. She turned away. Daniel did not apologize for the truth. He also did not press closer. Rachel gripped the edge of the work table. "I had one place before this," she said. "One kitchen. One thing I thought was mine. Henry sold it and told me I had misunderstood what I was worth there." Daniel said nothing. "So I came here." Her voice thinned. "And now the first thing I build, he follows." Daniel's hands remained at his sides. Rachel looked at him over her shoulder. "If he takes Red Mesa down with me, I won't forgive myself." Daniel's expression changed. Not softer, clearer. "You're making the same bargain he wants you to make." Rachel frowned. "You shrink, he gets peace." She looked away again. The room went very quiet. Then small footsteps came from the hall. Sophie stood there. She looked from Daniel to Rachel, then at the trunk. Nobody spoke. Sophie crossed the kitchen slowly. She did not take Rachel's hand. She simply stood beside the trunk, one small palm resting on the leather lid. Rachel's throat tightened. Daniel looked at Sophie, then at Rachel. He said nothing. That was what finally broke the argument. Not a speech, not a promise. A child standing beside a packed trunk. Rachel crossed the room. She knelt, opened the clasps. Sophie stepped back. Rachel lifted out the blue dress, hung it over her arm, then the brown dress, then the shawl. One thing at a time. Daniel watched from near the table. Rachel took the recipe bundle out last. She held it for a moment, then carried everything back upstairs. When she returned, the trunk remained open beside the door. Empty. Daniel had not moved it. Rachel closed the lid. "You still awake enough to work?" she asked. He looked confused. "Why?" "The wood box is half empty." Daniel glanced at it, then at her. Without a word, he put on his gloves and went outside. Rachel lit the lamp. A few minutes later, Daniel returned with an armful of split pine. He filled the box, then went for another. Rachel began measuring flour for morning bread. Neither spoke. Sophie climbed onto her usual stool near the wall. Daniel came back with the second load, brushed snow from his sleeves, and stacked the wood carefully. When the box was full, he stood. Rachel looked at him. "Thank you." He nodded. That all? For tonight. He turned toward the hall. Rachel stopped him. Daniel. He looked back. I'm staying. His face did not change much, but one hand loosened at his side. All right. No smile. No kiss. No grand promise. Just 2 words. And somehow they were enough. Later, after Daniel took Sophie upstairs, Rachel stood alone at the work table with flour on her hands and Henry's legal notice folded beside the ledger. For the first time, she did not think about running. She thought about proof, about Aunt Caroline's books, about the things Henry might have forgotten. And somewhere far back in her memory, a name returned. Louise Harper. Rachel reached for a clean sheet of paper. The letter took her nearly an hour. Not because she did not know what to say, because she did. That made it harder. Mrs. Louise Harper had rented an upstairs room over Aunt Caroline's bakery for almost 9 years. She had been a school teacher before arthritis stiffened her hands, and in exchange for reduced rent, she sometimes helped balance the household books at the end of each month. Rachel remembered her spectacles sliding down her nose, her habit of tapping columns with the blunt end of a pencil, her quiet voice saying, "At it again. Numbers do not become kinder because you are tired," Rachel wrote plainly. She told Louise that Henry had come to Colorado claiming ownership of the bakery recipes and profits. She described the paper with her signature and asked whether Louise remembered any agreement that gave Henry control over Rachel's work. Then she asked the question that mattered most. Did Aunt Caroline ever leave anything in writing about the bakery? Rachel folded the letter, sealed it, and gave it to Pete before breakfast. "Telegraph office if there's any way to send word faster," she said. Pete tucked it inside his coat. "I'll ask." Then there was nothing to do but wait. Rachel hated waiting. Work helped. She and Maggie kept the bread orders moving. Mrs. Cooper returned to her regular quantity, despite the gossip. The mining camp never reduced theirs at all. Daniel met twice with Pine Hollow's attorney, Mr. Jenkins, a tired-looking man with ink permanently darkening 2 fingers of his right hand. Henry's case was weak, Jenkins said. Weak was not the same as harmless. The copied agreement still bore Rachel's signature. Unless they could challenge when, how, or why it had been signed, Henry had something a judge would have to consider. For 6 days, no answer came from Missouri. On the 7th, snow began falling before daylight. Rachel was shaping loaves when she heard a horse come hard into the yard. Pete entered the kitchen with snow on his shoulders and an envelope in his hand. Mail coach got through last night. Rachel wiped her hands. The handwriting on the envelope trembled slightly with age. Louise Harper. Rachel sat before opening it. Daniel was in the room. So was Maggie. Nobody spoke. Rachel unfolded 4 pages. The first sentence made her close her eyes. "My dear Rachel, I have wondered for years whether you knew." Daniel moved closer to the table but stopped across from her. Rachel read on. Louise remembered the final months of Aunt Caroline's illness. Caroline had known Henry wanted the property sold. She had disagreed. The bakery itself was heavily mortgaged and likely could not pass intact to Rachel, but Caroline intended something else. The ovens, the smaller equipment, the recipes, and a percentage of the business savings that Rachel had helped generate. Louise had seen the household ledger where Caroline recorded it. More importantly, Caroline had written letters about it. Rachel's hands began trembling. Maggie pulled out a chair and sat beside her. "Keep going." Rachel did. Louise had kept 2 of the letters because Caroline asked her to witness the arrangement if necessary. Copies were enclosed. Rachel unfolded the first. Aunt Caroline's handwriting hit harder than she expected. Rounded letters, heavy pressure on the downstrokes. Rachel had not seen it in years. The letter named her directly. Rachel has worked beside me since she was 19. Whatever becomes of the property, the recipes in her keeping are hers to use, and the savings marked in the household ledger are to be set aside for her. Rachel stopped reading. Daniel looked down, giving her privacy without leaving. She breathed once and continued. The second letter was even clearer. Caroline wrote that Henry had been pressing her to sell quickly, and that she did not trust his urgency. Then Louise's own letter changed direction. There is something else you should know. Henry sold the bakery within 11 days of Caroline's burial, not because the business was failing, because he owed money. Louise had learned from a bank clerk that Henry had taken advances against expected estate proceeds. There were also private debts, gambling debts in St. Louis, large ones. Rachel looked up. Daniel's face had gone still. He needed the sale. Yes, Maggie whispered, and now he needs you. Rachel read the last page. Louise had also checked her old diary. On the date printed beside one witness's name on Henry's agreement, that man had not been in Kansas City. He had been in Topeka attending his brother's funeral. Louise knew because she had written the date beside a church collection entry. Daniel reached for the copied agreement. Which witness? Rachel pointed. Samuel Creel. Daniel stood so quickly the chair moved backward. Jenkins needs to see this. Rachel held up one hand. Wait. He stopped. She spread all the papers across the table. Letters. Dates. Copies. Henry's claim. Her ledger. She looked at the whole shape of it. For months, Henry had occupied a place in her memory larger than he deserved. He had been the man with the papers, the man who knew the accounts, the man who told her what things meant. Now, for the first time, she could see the other side. The hurry, the hidden debt, the missing ledger, the witness who could not have witnessed anything. He wasn't protecting the estate, Rachel said. Daniel sat again. No. He was protecting himself. Yes. Rachel looked down at Aunt Caroline's letter, and he thought I'd never ask. Daniel's voice was quiet. He thought you'd keep believing the version he handed you. Rachel met his eyes. That landed. She folded Aunt Caroline's letter carefully, not the way she had folded Henry's. This one she smoothed first. Daniel watched. What do you want to do? Rachel looked surprised. He could have said, we go to Jenkins, or this ends it, or I'll handle Henry. He did not. He asked. Rachel looked toward the window. Snow drifted past the glass. Sophie and Tommy were outside under Maggie's old red scarf, making something beside the woodpile. I want copies made. All of it? Yes. I want one set with Jenkins, one with you, one with me. Daniel nodded. And I want the originals kept somewhere Henry cannot reach. The bank box in Pine Hollow. Good. Maggie leaned forward. What about him? Rachel looked at Henry's letter. He still has to decide whether he wants to stand in front of a judge with that paper. Daniel almost smiled. Think he will? Yes. Why? Because men like Henry believe admitting they lied costs more than continuing the lie. Daniel leaned back. You know him well. I know the type of room he expects to control. The words hung there. Then Daniel tapped Samuel Creel's name. I may be able to prove this faster. How? Wade keeps old cattle sale receipts. One of his buyers is from Topeka. Same week. Rachel frowned. What does that prove? Nothing by itself. But the receipt has a newspaper clipping attached. Wade saves them when cattle prices are printed. Maggie stared at him. You save cattle newspapers? Daniel shrugged. Wade saves everything. That was true. The foreman had receipts older than Ben. An hour later, Wade produced a cracked leather folio from the ranch office. Inside were bills of sale, freight notices, veterinary receipts, and folded newspaper pieces. Daniel found the one he remembered, Topeka Weekly Register. The date matched. Near the bottom of the second column was a short funeral notice. Samuel Creel listed among family in attendance. Rachel read it twice, then handed it back. That is enough to make Henry explain himself. Daniel nodded. Probably. Not victory, but leverage. Real leverage. The next day, Rachel and Daniel rode to Pine Hollow together. The road was packed hard with snow, and their horses moved slowly through the shaded stretches where ice held beneath the cottonwoods. Neither talked much. At Jenkins' office, Rachel laid out the evidence herself. The attorney removed his spectacles, read Caroline's letters, read Louise's statement, read the funeral notice. Then he looked at Rachel over the rims of his glasses. Miss Turner, if these originals are genuine, your cousin has a serious problem. Rachel sat straight. Not me? Jenkins's mouth moved slightly. You still have a hearing to get through. That wasn't my question. He considered her. No. He tapped Henry's copied agreement. Not you. Outside, Pine Hollow was busy with afternoon wagons. Rachel stood on the boardwalk while Daniel tied the document packet beneath his coat. Across the street, through the hotel window, she saw Henry. He was sitting at a table near the front. Coffee cup, clean collar, newspaper open. He looked up. Their eyes met through the glass. Henry smiled, the same measured smile he had used all her life. Rachel did not smile back. She simply stood there. Henry's expression changed first, only slightly. But enough. Daniel followed her gaze. That's him? Yes. He looks worried. He looks polite. Same thing? Not usually. For the first time since Henry's letter arrived, Rachel felt something settle inside her. Not certainty. Not yet. But footing. Henry had come west believing she still stood where he had left her. Alone. Unsure. Dependent on whatever papers he placed in front of her. He had not counted on ledgers. He had not counted on Louise Harper. He had not counted on Daniel asking, "What do you want to do?" Most of all, he had not counted on Rachel learning to ask the same question of herself. She turned away from the hotel window. Let's go home. Daniel did not miss the word. Home. He untied the horses, and neither of them looked back. The hearing was set for the following Thursday. By then, half of Pine Hollow knew about it. News moved fast in a town where one courthouse room served for everything from land disputes to unpaid feed bills, and Rachel could feel people watching when she came in with the bread wagon that morning. She ignored them. Daniel walked beside her carrying the document box. Not ahead, not behind, beside. That mattered. The courthouse stood at the corner of Main and Walnut, a square brick building with narrow windows and a bell mounted above the roofline. Snow had melted along the boardwalk, leaving dark strips of mud beside the hitching rails. Wade had come too, so had Maggie. Mrs. Cooper sat in the second row, with her hands folded over her handbag, as though she had every right in the world to be there. Henry arrived 10 minutes later with his attorney. He wore a charcoal coat, polished boots, and the same expression he had always used when entering a room where he expected other people to move aside. Rachel watched him speak quietly to the lawyer. No nervous gestures, no visible anger. That was Henry. He behaved best when he believed appearance still belonged to him. Daniel leaned slightly toward Rachel. "You all right?" "Yes." He looked at her hands. They were clasped too tightly. Rachel loosened them. "Now I am." Daniel nodded. The territorial judge entered shortly after 9. Judge Amos Keller was an older man with white hair at his temples and a voice that carried without effort. The room settled. Henry's attorney stood first. His name was Mr. Pike. He spoke smoothly. He described the Kansas City bakery as a family enterprise. He described the recipes as inherited property. He described Rachel as a relative who had helped in the business but never owned it. Then he began speaking about Red Mesa. Daniel shifted beside her. Rachel felt it. Mr. Pike suggested Daniel had provided the money, equipment, customers, transportation, and reputation that allowed Rachel's operation to succeed. "That is not accurate," Rachel whispered. Daniel looked at her. "I know," Mr. Pike continued. He called Rachel inexperienced in formal business. He referred to her limited understanding of estate matters. Then he said the success of Turner's Red Mesa bread had likely been substantially directed by Mr. Mercer. Daniel's chair scraped. Rachel put one hand lightly on his sleeve. He stopped. She did not look at him. After a moment, Daniel settled back into the chair. His jaw remained tight. Mr. Pike called Henry. Henry told the story Rachel had expected. Aunt Caroline had run the bakery. Rachel had worked there. Henry handled the estate. Rachel had become distressed after the funeral and misunderstood the settlement. He said this gently, almost sadly. "I never wanted conflict with Rachel," he told the judge. "She is family. I only want the property handled honestly." Rachel stared at him. There it was. The old method. Take from her. Then look wounded when she objected. Mr. Jenkins stood. "Mr. Sloan, were you in debt when you sold Caroline Turner's bakery?" Henry hesitated. Most men in business carry debt. That wasn't the question. A murmur moved through the room. Henry's mouth tightened. "Yes, I had obligations." "Gambling obligations?" Mr. Pike stood. "Objection!" Judge Keller looked at Jenkins. "Make it relevant." Jenkins held up Aunt Caroline's letters. The witness claims his rapid sale of the bakery was necessary to settle an estate. These documents suggest he sold property quickly while concealing assets intended for Miss Turner. The judge allowed it. Henry's calm began to thin. Not much. Enough. Then came the copied agreement. Jenkins placed it on the table. "Samuel Creel signed this as witness?" "Yes." "On November 14th? "Yes." Jenkins unfolded the Topeka newspaper. And yet Mr. Creel attended his brother's funeral in Topeka that same day. Henry looked at Pike. Pike looked at the document. For the first time, nobody had an immediate answer. Rachel felt Daniel turn slightly toward her. She kept her eyes forward. The strongest part had not happened yet. Mr. Jenkins called Rachel. She walked to the front. Her shoes sounded louder than they should have against the wooden floor. She sat, swore to tell the truth, then looked at the judge. Jenkins started with the recipes. "Who wrote them?" "My aunt wrote some. I wrote others. We changed most of them together over the years. Did your aunt ever tell you that you could use them after leaving the bakery?" "Yes." "Did you believe they belonged solely to Henry Sloan?" "No." "Did Mr. Sloan ever pay you for them?" No. Then Jenkins shifted to Red Mesa. This was the part Rachel understood better than anything else in the room. He handed her the first flour receipt. Rachel explained it. The hotel order, the mining camp order, the price per loaf, the cost of lard, the cost of wood. Maggie's wages, the wagon runs, the split under Rachel and Daniel's signed agreement. One ledger became two became 5. The numbers built themselves across the table, month by month, order by order. Rachel did not speak quickly. She did not defend herself with emotion. She simply showed the work. Mr. Pike rose for cross-examination. You expect this court to believe you created all of this yourself? Rachel looked at him. No. He blinked. No. No. Maggie helps me bake. Pete delivers. Mrs. Cooper buys regularly. Daniel provides ranch equipment under our agreement. Wade records ranch expenses. Pike smiled slightly. So Mr. Mercer does support the enterprise? Of course. Then perhaps its success is more his than yours. Rachel leaned forward. No. The room went quiet. He is part of it, she said. That is different. Pike glanced toward Daniel. Did Mr. Mercer teach you bookkeeping? No. Pricing? No. Supply management? No. Contracts? No. Did he provide the original recipes? No. Customers? No. Then what exactly did he provide? Rachel looked toward Daniel. He was watching her. Still. Waiting. Rachel answered without looking away. A fair agreement. Something moved through the courtroom. Not noise exactly. Recognition. Pike shifted. You were never formally educated in business, were you? No. You did not attend a commercial college? No. You did not inherit capital? No. So how did you know what to do? Rachel looked back at him. I paid attention. That stopped him. She continued. I kept receipts. I counted what went in and what came out. I wrote down what people bought. When something did not work, I changed it. Pike frowned. That sounds very simple. It is. A few people smiled. Even Judge Keller's mouth moved. Rachel went on. Simple does not mean easy. Mr. Pike had no answer to that. By mid-afternoon, the room smelled of damp wool and stove smoke. Judge Keller took a recess. Rachel stood in the hallway with Daniel. Neither spoke at first. Finally, he said, A fair agreement. Rachel looked at him. That surprised you? No. It looked like it did. Daniel's mouth moved slightly. I'm trying not to become unbearable about being right. Rachel almost smiled. You should keep trying. The judge returned. Everyone stood. Judge Keller dismissed Henry's claim. Not quietly. He stated that the submitted agreement contained substantial questions regarding authenticity and witness verification, and that the matter should be referred for further examination. Henry's face went pale. The claim against Red Mesa was dismissed with it. Rachel exhaled. That was all. One breath, then another. Henry turned toward her as people began moving. His lawyer said something she did not hear. Henry ignored him. You think this makes you clever? Rachel said nothing. Daniel stood. Henry looked at him. She's your problem now. Daniel's chair stopped moving. His voice stayed even. She was never yours. Henry's face hardened. Rachel touched Daniel's sleeve. He looked at her, then stepped back. Rachel faced Henry herself. And I'm not his either. Henry stared. Rachel's voice did not rise. I'm mine. The words sat in the courtroom. No flourish, no applause. Just truth. For years, Rachel had imagined victory as something loud. A door slammed, a man humbled, a crowd admitting it had been wrong. This felt different, quieter, more solid. Henry looked at her as if trying to find the woman he had known in Kansas City. The one who signed where he pointed. The one who apologized when confused. The one who left because staying seemed impossible. Rachel waited. Henry looked away first. That was enough. Outside, the afternoon sun struck the snow along the rooftops so brightly Rachel had to squint. People spilled onto the courthouse steps. Mrs. Cooper hugged Maggie. Wade shook Jenkins's hand. Daniel remained beside Rachel without touching her. Her knees suddenly felt weak. She reached for the railing. Daniel noticed. His hand lifted, then stopped. Waiting. Rachel looked at him. Before either of them moved, a small figure pushed through the people behind them. Sophie. She came straight toward Rachel, and for the first time in almost 2 years, she opened her mouth to speak. Stay. The word was quiet. So quiet Rachel almost thought the cold air had shaped it. Daniel did not move. Neither did Wade. Mrs. Cooper's hand went to her mouth. Sophie stood on the courthouse step with her coat unbuttoned, cheeks pink from the cold, one mitten missing. She looked up at Rachel as though the whole crowded street had disappeared, and there was only this one thing she needed answered. Rachel dropped to her knees. Her skirt touched the wet edge of the step. For a second, she could not speak either. Sophie reached for her hand. Stay, she said again. Clearer this time. Rachel closed both hands around the small one. I'm staying. Sophie stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Rachel's neck. Rachel held her, not tightly, not in a way that trapped. Just enough. Over Sophie's shoulder, Rachel looked at Daniel. He had turned his face slightly away. His eyes were closed. One hand rested against the courthouse railing as though he needed something steady beneath it. When he looked back, Rachel saw a man trying very hard to keep himself together in front of half of Pine Hollow. Sophie pulled back. Daniel crouched beside her. Sweetheart? Sophie looked at him. Daniel swallowed. He did not ask her to say anything else. He did not ask whether she could. He only touched 2 fingers lightly to her hair. Sophie leaned into him. That was enough. The ride back to Red Mesa was slow. Snowmelt had turned sections of the road to mud, and the wagon wheels sank deep wherever the sun had reached the ground. Sophie sat between Rachel and Daniel beneath a heavy blanket. She did not speak again. Nobody asked her to. Rachel kept one hand resting near Sophie's on the seat, not holding it, just there. Twice Sophie moved her fingers until they touched Rachel's. By the time the Red Mesa gate came into view, the sun was lowering behind the mountains and throwing long blue shadows across the snow. Wade rode ahead to open the gate. Ben waited near the barn. Maggie stood outside the kitchen with Tommy beside her. Nobody cheered. Daniel had apparently warned them before leaving Pine Hollow that whatever happened with Sophie would be handled quietly. That meant more to Rachel than celebration would have. Ben removed his hat. Maggie smiled. Rachel stepped down from the wagon. Then she turned and held out both hands. Sophie came down into them. That evening, Rachel baked bread. She could have taken the night off. Daniel told her so. She ignored him. The kitchen needed bread, and after a day like that, she needed flour under her hands. Sophie sat at the end of the work table. She shaped a piece of dough into a horse. The same crooked legs, the same long neck. Rachel looked at it. Sophie looked back. Better than the first one, Rachel said. Sophie's mouth moved. No sound. Then the faintest smile. Rachel went back to kneading. Weeks passed. Then months. Spring reached Red Mesa slowly. First, the snow pulled away from the south-facing slopes. Then the creek opened. Then the road to Pine Hollow dried enough for wagon traffic without chains. The hearing ended Henry's claim, but Red Mesa still had debt to manage. The bread business mattered. So did the cattle sale. So did Daniel finally selling a section of low ground he had been holding onto because his father had owned it before him. He hated doing it. Rachel sat with him at the kitchen table while he signed the deed. He stared at the paper for a long time after the ink dried. "You all right?" she asked. "No." She nodded. He looked at her. "You're not going to tell me it was the right thing? You already know whether it was." Daniel folded the deed. "That's inconvenient." "I try." By June, the ranch was no longer safe exactly, but it was stable. Stable was enough. Rachel's bakery account had grown too. Not quickly. Honestly. Hotel orders. Mining camp orders. Bread for the general store again after Mr. Hale apologized and asked whether she would consider returning. She did, at full price. Maggie laughed for 10 straight minutes when Rachel told her. Near the end of summer, Daniel had a small building moved from an unused part of the ranch yard to the road near the gate. It had once been a harness shed. Rachel found him there one morning with Wade, both of them measuring the front wall. "What are you doing?" Daniel looked over. "Nothing." Wade coughed. Rachel narrowed her eyes. 3 weeks later, the old shed had a new roof, 2 work tables, a proper oven, shelves, and a wide front window facing the road. The sign arrived from Pine Hollow on a Thursday. Rachel stood in front of it while Daniel held it against the wall. "Whittaker." She frowned. "That is not my name." Daniel looked at the painter. The painter looked horrified. Rachel pointed at the board. "You wrote Whittaker." The man pulled off his hat. "Mrs. Cooper gave me the order." Daniel rubbed his forehead. Rachel started laughing. The sign was corrected the next day. Turner Bakery at Red Mesa. Rachel stood beneath it with both hands on her hips. Daniel came beside her. "Better?" "Much." "Your name big enough?" "Almost." He looked at her. She looked back. The silence changed. They had been doing this for months, standing too long, looking too carefully, stopping before either of them crossed into something that had no easy way back. That evening, Daniel came to the bakery after supper. Rachel was alone. The last loaves had been taken from the oven. Outside, crickets sounded from the grass. The ranch yard was dark except for the lantern near the barn. Daniel stood in the doorway. Rachel looked up. "You need bread?" "No." "Coffee?" "No." "That eliminates most of your reasons for coming in here." "I know." Rachel set down the cloth in her hands. Daniel removed his hat. That made her heart beat differently. He always removed his hat when he had something serious to say. "Rachel." "Yes?" "I'm not very good at this." "That is a dangerous beginning." He almost smiled. Then did not. "I love you." The room went still. Rachel looked at him. Daniel continued before she could answer. "I didn't say it before because I didn't want you wondering whether it came with a debt attached." Her eyes softened. "It doesn't." "No." "I know." I wanted you to know you could stand without me before I asked you to stand with me. Rachel looked down at the flower on her hands, then back at him. You have been asking me with your eyes for half a year. Daniel blinked. What? You thought you were subtle? I hoped. You were not. That finally made him smile. Rachel stepped closer. Daniel stayed where he was, waiting. She closed the last foot of distance herself, then kissed him, softly. When she pulled back, Daniel looked almost surprised. Rachel smiled. You may court me. May I? If you improve your dancing. That seems unreasonable. Then we are beginning honestly. They courted through late summer, not dramatically. Daniel brought her wildflowers once and immediately admitted Sophie had chosen them. Rachel packed food for his long cattle days. He repaired the bakery steps when one board loosened. She fixed the sleeve of his coat after it tore on barbed wire. They sat on the porch after dark. Sometimes they spoke. Sometimes they did not. Sophie began using words again the same way spring returned to the mountains. Slowly. A word at breakfast. Another at supper. Short sentences when nobody watched too closely. Maggie's boy Tommy argued with her constantly about the correct way to make dough animals. That helped more than any solemn encouragement could have. By autumn, Daniel asked Rachel to marry him. No crowd, no ring he could not afford. Just the two of them at the bakery door near sunset. Rachel said yes. They married in October beneath the cottonwoods near the ranch house. Yellow leaves moved across the yard in the wind. Mrs. Cooper cried openly. Ben pretended he had dust in both eyes. Wade shook Daniel's hand, then Rachel's, and said, "Bakery accounts look strong." Rachel laughed. "That your blessing?" "Best one I've got." Sophie stood between Daniel and Rachel during the ceremony. Afterward, while the others gathered near the long tables for cake and coffee, Sophie tugged Rachel's sleeve. Rachel bent down. Sophie held something in both hands. A dough horse, baked hard, crooked, one leg repaired with a visible seam. Rachel recognized the shape. "The first one?" she asked. Sophie shook her head. "I made it again." Her voice was still soft. "But sure." Rachel took it carefully. "It's beautiful." Sophie studied her for a moment, then asked, "Can I call you Mama?" Rachel stopped breathing. Daniel heard. He went still several feet away. Rachel looked at Sophie. There were 100 things she could have said. She chose the simplest. "If that's what you want." Sophie nodded. "That's what I want." Rachel pulled her close. Above Sophie's shoulder, she saw Daniel turn away and wipe his eyes with the back of one hand. Years later, the little dough horse still sat on a shelf in the bakery. So did Rachel's first partnership agreement with Daniel. Folded, yellowed, still readable. The bakery grew. Maggie eventually ran half the morning orders herself. Sophie grew tall and sharp-eyed and never lost the habit of correcting people when they shaped horses badly. Red Mesa survived good years and poor ones. There were storms, drought, cattle losses, new calves, broken fences, spring mud, long winters, life. One cold morning, long after the hearing and the first smile and that impossible first word on the courthouse steps, Rachel stood at the bakery window before sunrise. Bread proofed beneath clean cloths, coffee steamed in her mug. Beyond the glass, Daniel crossed the yard carrying an armful of wood. He had more gray in his hair now. He entered, stamped snow from his boots, and filled the box beside the stove. Rachel watched him. "You know that box was already half full." "I noticed." You filled it anyway. I remember a woman once complaining about that. She was right. Usually is. Rachel looked toward the shelf. The little horse leaned slightly to one side, but it stood. Daniel followed her gaze. Bread ready? Not yet. How long? Rachel pressed one finger gently into the nearest loaf. The dough rose back slowly. She smiled. It just needs enough time. Outside, dawn began spreading over the Colorado mountains. Inside, the oven was warm, and Rachel Turner, who had once believed she needed to make herself smaller to keep a place in the world, stood in a kitchen bearing her own name with the man she had chosen nearby, and the sound of Sophie laughing somewhere across the yard. Nothing about the life had been given easily. That was part of why it belonged to her. Imagine standing where Rachel once stood, with one trunk behind you and a road ahead that offered no promises. Imagine spending years being measured by other people's expectations, then finally finding someone who didn't ask you to become smaller, quieter, or easier to love. And imagine discovering that the place you were afraid to call home had been waiting for you to choose it for yourself. Rachel didn't heal Sophie with bread. Daniel didn't rescue Rachel with a ranch. They simply gave one another something life had denied them for too long. Patience without pressure, loyalty without ownership, and love without conditions attached. Sometimes healing arrives that quietly. A crooked dough horse on a windowsill, a wood box filled without being asked, a man who stands beside you without standing in front of you, a frightened little girl finding one word worth speaking. Stay. Maybe that's what family becomes at its best. Not the people who promise there will never be another hard winter, but the ones who keep a place warm for you when it comes. If Rachel's journey touched something in you, leave a comment and tell us what moment stayed with you most. And if you'd like to spend more evenings with stories of love, mystery, second chances, and wounded hearts finding their way home, you're warmly invited to subscribe. There are many more stories waiting down the trail.